tell me about your early life. I heard that you were actually, as a kid, you were actually building model rockets and things. Had you always been interested in space?
I have, but not as an astronaut, because there wasn't anything called astronauts in those days. I actually grew up in Milwaukee, and but I had, aunt and uncle down here in Chicago, and so I would come down here as a kid. They lived out in Oak Park, and I would then by myself go down to the museums, to the Museum of Science and Industry. I was at the Adler one time in those early years, and because I liked interactive, doing things, seeing things. I really enjoyed the stars and astronomy. And I became a Boy Scout when I was in Milwaukee, and one of the merit badges was astronomy. And then during high school, this was during the war years, World War II, and I had read a lot about Robert Goddard's work. Now, Robert Goddard was a sort of the American pioneer of developing of liquid fuel rockets. Started in 1926, as a matter of fact, and he did a lot of work out at Roswell, New Mexico. I was very much interested in that. And then, of course, towards the end of the war, we learned about the German activity. In fact, I think we had on display one time a captured V2 engine that was going through Milwaukee. And so a friend of ours, a friend of mine, a classmate, and I decided to build some rockets. Now, model rocketry today is a really scientific hobby. I mean, they have all sorts of things you could buy at hobby stores, engines and propellants and things like that. But in those days, that was something entirely new. And we made one out of a mailing tube, built the engine out of wood with a nozzle. We tried to duplicate what we had. I had some books on it. And the fuel was essentially gunpowder, but we mixed sulfur and potassium nitrate and charcoal and the proper ingredients. Our our chemistry teacher sort of gave us a hand on that. He didn't do the actual work. He said, here's the ingredients that you need to have. And so we did that and packed it down with a sort of a filler that we had, real tight. And it worked, but I mean, a lot of times the filler got loose, and instead of having a rocket propellant going up, it would get so loose that it would sort of explode on its way up. And those days, I'm wondering why I didn't get hurt doing this kind of work. But that got me interested in rockets. This was back in 1945, 44, that era.
When did you take your first airplane ride?
I had one airplane ride when I was a youngster. My father's company had a pilot that, it was an old Waco airplane, twin wings, two wings. And they went around to the various cities that the company was involved in. And it came to where I was at that time, Lewiston, Pennsylvania. I was just a youngster. And I got a ride. That was the only time I had an airplane ride. And so it wasn't until I was already at the Naval Academy where I started to fly back to Milwaukee on commercial that I even had a flight. But my uncle was a graduate of the Academy out of the class of 1913, and became the 58th Naval Aviator. So although I never flew until I really, started going to Pensacola, he gave me all sorts of, talks and about naval aviation and things like that. So that made me very enthusiastic.
When did you go into the flight program in the Navy? When did you start training?
Well, as I got towards the end of high school, I really wanted to become a rocket engineer. And I had written to the American Rocket Society, which is now the AIAA, a huge affair, how I could become a rocket engineer. And essentially they said, well, there's no discipline specifically in that field in colleges, But if you take thermodynamics and mechanics and math and things like that, time will come where they'll all be good, so you can utilize those. And then at the end, he said, be sure if you want to go to places like MIT or Caltech. To tell you the truth, I couldn't afford any of that. My father died when I was 12, and so I didn't know how I was going to go to college. And then there was a program for the Navy to recruit naval aviators, because just after the war, more naval aviators left the service than the Navy expected. So suddenly there was a shortage. And so an admiral by the name of Holloway started this Holloway program of sending college or high school students that had very good grades down to Pensacola for 2 years of flight training, then out to sea as midshipmen. And then after about 6 months of that, if they qualified, they'd become an ensign, and then they would send them back to their last 2 years of college. It was a great program. And so I volunteered, and I was accepted. And I went down to Pensacola to start becoming a naval aviator, following my second goal. I couldn't get into school to really become interested in rockets, and so I became a naval aviator. But I only went through pre-flight when I got an appointment to the Naval Academy, because my mother wanted me to get my education all at one time. So I left that program, went to the Naval Academy, graduated, 52, but because I had started into aviation, they put me right back into training, and I got my wings in 1954.
What were you flying?
Pardon?
Did you go out to the carriers at that point, or?
Yes, what I did was I was one of the first people that got into jet training too. So I was assigned to a large squadron out in California, Moffett Field, and they trained night fighter teams. Now, I was a rookie out there. Most of these people that are training for night flying off of carriers are second tour pilots, because night flying off carriers had not yet been perfected in the early 50s. Most of the squadrons flew in the daytime, and then they settled down at night. But they did need some support at night, and so they only sent teams out for that. About 4 airplanes, 5 pilots, about 30 enlisted as a team. And I got on one of those teams, and fortunately I got through it okay, but I mean, it was quite an adventure for me being a rookie. And when I got back, the squadron actually changed its mission. Instead of taking teams out for night work, they became what we know as a replacement air group squadron. They got all the new airplanes in that the Navy was now getting, and they were training the skippers and the execs and the maintenance people and the operations people, about 4 people of each squadron, how to fly these new airplanes. And then they would go down to their squadrons and teach the rest of the squadron how to fly the airplanes. And I ended up being an instructor in these new airplanes, which was really, really an enjoyment to fly all these new airplanes and then instruct on them. And after I was there for about 2 years, I applied for test pilot school, and I was accepted as a test pilot at Patuxent River, Maryland. Went through test pilot school and then was there until for about 2 years, and then I was assigned to be an instructor on a brand new airplane that I did most of the test work on. It was called the Phantom, the F-4, and I was assigned down to Oceana in Virginia. And while I was there, I had applied for the space program earlier, back in 1958, as a matter of fact, just after I graduated from test pilot school, but I didn't make it. That was for the original 7 that actually got it. And when I got down to Oceana, my squadron, I applied again because they were looking for some more, and I was accepted this time. And so in October of '62, I went to Houston to join the space program.
So in '62, you're going to astronaut training. What they were gearing up for the moon race, of course. Kennedy had kind of drawn the line in the sand on that. what would there? We had Project Mercury, but there had to be an intermediary stage before Apollo was to come along. So you were going into the Gemini program?
The Gemini program was the intermediate stage. Actually, when I got in the program in October of '62, Mercury was still flying. First thing we did was to go down to Cape Canaveral and watch Wally Schirra go up in his Mercury flight, and then we, of course, we started training for Gemini, and there were 12 Gemini flights, and it was really an interesting program, because what it was doing all the research and development work that would be required to go to the moon.
Basically, Gemini was there to fine-tune and actually develop and then later refine the techniques you would need for Apollo.
There were certain things we had to prove out and to test before we'd ever try to go to the moon. And on Gemini 7, what we were trying to do is a long-duration flight and a rendezvous, which we ended up rendezvousing with Gemini 6. Two things that had to be proved, because a lot of medical people didn't think that the human body could be in space for 2 weeks. We evolved on Earth's gravity, so it appeared that in the evolutionary phase of the human being that our functions would be sort of guaranteed towards that. But it turned out that we could last in zero gravity just as well as we can in gravity.
I remember as a kid, I was probably about 8 or 9 when you were doing that, and I thought the Gemini was the coolest looking. I thought, yeah, Mercury was neat, but now you got two guys together and they're actually flying in formation, and it was the neatest thing.
That's right. That came about because they were supposed to rendezvous with an unmanned satellite called a Gina, and the Gina didn't make it into orbit. And so at the last minute, which shows really the good leadership of NASA at that time, they decided that, well, why don't we just have Gemini 7 is going to be up there for 2 weeks. Why don't we have Gemini 6 rendezvous on? Then we can prove the rendezvous, not the docking, but just the rendezvous. And that's exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. And then later, Gemini 12, which was, I believe, the last of that series.
Gemini 12 wrapped up everything that we had to do. One of the big problems we had through Gemini 9, 10, and 11 was how to work outside the spacecraft. Because when we got the astronauts outside, we all forgot Newton's third law of motion, that for every action there's an opposite and equal reaction. And when they would touch the spacecraft, they would repel them. And so on Gemini 12, we had to figure out how best to do work outside. And we used actually a boys' swimming pool up in Baltimore and put a mock-up of the Gemini in the water. And we had Buzz Aldrin in a spacesuit, which works just as well underwater as it does in space if you put lead weights around his body to make him neutrally buoyant. And that's how we found out the techniques to work in zero gravity, which of course now in our shuttle program you saw people all the time working outside the orbiters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just the engineering challenge of doing something like Apollo. You have a rocket that's 360 some odd feet tall. I've read a lot about it. Everything from drilling the plates and everything in the bottom of the main engines and everything, trying to get the fans to spray right and everything, all the way up to the command module. An incredible challenge for this country.
That's right. The Apollo program was really a triumph of thousands of people and hundreds of companies who got a mandate, a commitment that President Kennedy said we'll go to the moon by the end of the decade, and working together and making sure that everything fit. I mean, there's all sorts of major companies that had to put their vehicles working together on top of a booster that had to make sure it was working, and it had thousands of parts all working together. And so it is really, I think, in the 20th century, one of the greatest accomplishments that this country had done.
There were several test flights on the Apollo series, of course, after the fire that was so tragic. Why did they decide to do the all-up testing like that as one approach?
Well, that was a concept I think that the NASA hierarchy decided to do. Von Braun was an advocate of all-up testing. But the actual flight of 8 who was not going to go to the moon at that time. Two things happened in 1968 that changed the mission completely, which also demonstrated that sometimes bold decisions bring in very good results. One thing, Apollo 8 was going to test the lunar module in Earth orbit along with the command module, and the only one difference between Apollo 7 and 8 was the fact, and the lunar module, was we were going to go up high and then come back in at a speed that was comparable to coming back from the moon. But Grumman, who built the lunar module, said, we can't deliver a lunar module before the end of 1968. It will be 1969 before we can really get one. And then we also knew that the Russians, at that time the Soviets, were going to send a man around the moon, not just circumnavigate, not to orbit, in the late fall of 1968. And we know now, of course, that they were very adequate that they were going to do that. That was their plan. They had sent up a couple of spacecrafts around the moon called Zond with animals to see if this was feasible. The first one was a failure. The second one was pretty much of a success. Then in Russia, they debated, should we send another animal flight up to make sure before we commit the cosmonauts? In this country, we said if Apollo 7, that will orbit the Earth and the command service module will prove out to be feasible and good, we'll send Apollo 8 all the way to the moon. And the big Saturn V booster, we only made 2 unmanned flights on it, and this was the 3rd flight to go all the way to the moon. And as it turned out, of course, we were very successful on that flight.
What was your feeling when you found out that you were actually going to go there on Apollo 8?
It was kind of interesting because I was first assigned after my Gemini 12 to be on Neil Armstrong's Apollo 11 mission. And then Mike Collins was on Apollo 8 when it was still an Earth orbital flight. And then Mike had a medical problem which delayed him till he went on 11. And I took his spot on 8. And at the time I took his spot, then after that, we switched our missions to go to the moon, which to me was kind of nice because to go to the moon for the first time. It was part of the highlight of my career, really. Being the first 3 people to see the far side of the moon, to see the Earth as it really is. Just a small body, blue and white ball, and to be part of a pathfinder going that distance.
At the time you did that, it's December of 1968. It's Christmas time back on Earth, and things were in a hell of a shape back here at that time.
It was a bad year for the United States.
Yeah, the cities were on fire. There was the Vietnam War, all sorts of unrest, and you ended up taking turns reading from the book of Genesis. Who came up with that?
Well, when we determined on the trajectory that we would burn into lunar orbit on Christmas Eve, we said, my gosh, a screenwriter couldn't do better than this. Well, what should we say? And we couldn't think of anything. Then we had a very good friend in the United States Information Agency who followed us all the time and when we went overseas trips and everything. And we asked him. And so, he thought about it. He wasn't too successful, but he had a newspaper friend that he called. He said, look, the Apollo 8 crew needs to say something appropriate when they're circling the moon. You're a newspaper man. You should come up with, good words to say. So this fellow, I think his name was Leighton, started to write down what he could do. Spent most of the evening trying to do that. It was about midnight, and he still hadn't come up with anything really appropriate when his wife came downstairs and said, what are you doing? And he said, gave her the story about what he was assigned to do. And she said, why don't you tell the crew to read the first 10 verses of Genesis from the Old Testament? Because that is the basis, not just of the Christian religion, but Islam and also the Jewish religion. And it would impact most of the people who would be tuned in listening to them. And so that's how it came to pass.
Wow. Love that. Of course, 11 actually landed, and think the whole world was up that night watching.
I was Neil's backup.
Yeah.
So I was very diligently looking to see how well he was, you know.
In the end, he did pretty well, didn't he?
He did very good, yeah.
Yeah. It's so sad having, as we're talking here, his passing was so recently.
Yes, really, Neil's passing was a real shame at this particular time. You know, I look at it really that, you know, it sort of closed the book on the Camelot of manned spaceflight for this period. That was a certain period there that I don't think is going to be relived. The excitement, the thrill, how the people of the world suddenly, especially the young people, how they took to space flight and how they became interested in becoming astronauts and what they were doing.
I want to get back to that in a moment, but I think you're right. It's hard to gin up that kind of excitement with what people can do and see these days. But on to Apollo 13. What was the goal of that mission? It was obviously not carried out the way you thought, but what was the original purpose of that mission? What were we supposed to
Well, the first two flights landed on the moon in the flat areas. And we did that specifically to give them the greatest chance of survival, not knowing really what was there. But we brought back material from those two flights. And now the scientists really said, look, we want a mission to go into the hills of the highlands of the moon because the reflectivity is much brighter there. The material might be different. We know there's ejecta thrown up by volcanism in the early stages of the moon's history, or meteorites hitting that area, and it'll leave a lot of that stuff on the ground, and that could tell us about the interior of the moon. And so we were designated to go to a place called Fra Mauro, a large crater in about the center of the moon, to land alongside of it in the hills of the highlands surrounding that crater.
When did you know something went wrong? When you were on your way out? He was doing the stirring of the cryogenic tanks, and what was it? Were you asleep at that point, or where were you on the ship?
No, we had just finished a TV program, broadcasting it to folks back here on Earth, and it was at about 55 hours. I could almost tell don't know the minutes and the seconds, but 55 hours in the flight time that this occurred. And we didn't know exactly what happened. We heard a large bang. We thought at first we lost one of our batteries. Sometimes the battery produces, an explosive gas. But it wasn't until I saw the oxygen escaping from the rear of my spacecraft and looked at the needles on my quantity gauges of oxygen that I knew that we were in deep trouble.
How much training or preparation had you had up to this point for a scenario like you encountered?
Well, we trained for a lot of failures, but this was a failure of all failures because it was not just one failure. I mean, we lost 2 oxygen tanks, 3 fuel cells, computer went off the line, lost the communications for a while. And so it was a case where we had to start from scratch. You know, what went wrong? How do we get home? It had to be one of analysis, because very quickly we found out that we weren't going to live in the command module. Its oxygen was gone, so it forced us into the lunar module. The lunar module had never been designed to come back home again. Didn't have a heat shield. You know, supposed to last only 45 hours. And when the explosion occurred, we were 90 hours from home. We had to go around the moon. And so it was a case of step by step, looking at one crisis at a time and how to figure out how to solve them. And it was really a classic case of crisis management, a case where good leadership on the part of the mission control team, the teamwork involved there, along with the teamwork that we had in the spacecraft, the use of initiative, figured out how to solve a crisis like we were being poisoned by our own carbon dioxide, how to get rid of that successfully. These are the things that turned an almost certain catastrophe into a successful failure or a successful recovery.
When when did it? I know you've been asked this probably 1,000 times, but or more. When did you know that you had a chance to actually pull this off and get back home safely?
Well, when I knew exactly that we had pulled this off with no strays was when we splashed in the water in the ocean and didn't sink. You know, then we knew it was good because the odds of getting home were going up after solving every crisis as we went along. But the last crisis really was the parachutes, because the way we put them out was with pyrotechnics. Normally, we'd keep those pyrotechnics warm so they would fire when we needed them, but they were cold soaked for 4 days because we couldn't afford the electrical power to keep them warm and do everything else. And so had we, at the time, to put out the parachutes, if they didn't fire, we'd have landed exactly where we wanted to land in the ocean and with the task force nearby, but we'd be going so fast that we wouldn't survive.
Well, also, wasn't there a navigation issue on coming back from the moon? That
Well, very much so. We were outside of our entry corridor to make a safe landing and required a procedure which we had developed for Apollo 8 because we were so unsure of the navigation, the communications, and everything else in Apollo 8 that this procedure was just one more emergency procedure in case all that didn't work. But after Apollo 8, we tore the procedures out of the flight manuals. But I had remembered them, which was sort of a nice thing that I was on Apollo 8 and then also on Apollo 13 because I remembered this procedure to readjust our re-entry angle to make a safe landing.
because if you were too low, you'd burn up. If you were too high, you'd
Well,
skip
if we were
off.
too shallow,
Yeah.
we'd skip off,
Yeah.
like skipping a stone on water, and we would be gone. If we were too steep, we'd have been a fire meteor for a few brief seconds, and that would be it.
How, psychologically, how did you handle this whole thing? From what I've read and what I've seen in the movie and everything, that it was extremely uncomfortable in there, and places things dripping with condensation and cold.
As it got colder and colder, the atmosphere, of course, the water condensed out of the atmosphere and everything was wet. Well, we had no alternative. I mean, we could have bounced off the walls and panicked for 10 minutes and we'd be right back where we started from. So we said, well, what do we have? What's going on? And can Mission Control help? And of course they did.
Yeah. And there was a lot of support going on. They had, all the same engineering, all the same gear down there, and they were trying to see what it would do in the situation.
That's right. They tried to figure out the procedures to use, and they were very helpful in getting that one procedure to speed up to get back home again after we left around the moon.
When you splashed down, what was the feeling on board?
Huge sigh of relief. I'd like to see that water over the window, and when the scuba guys came over and you knocked on the window, we're very happy.
No doubt. Got to ask about the movie. It was one of the best ones I've seen. How close to the reality of what you experienced were they able to capture?
The movie was very accurate. All the incidents were true. Well, there's one that was not true, and that was the argument sometime in the middle where, they argued about who threw the switch and things like that. And we as a crew argued that that was never in the real thing. The crew or the cast was reading the air-to-ground transcripts and told the director, hey, this was not in the real thing. Why are we putting it in? And Ron Howard, the director, said, look, I have to show anxiety or suspense, and I can't do it by just having a close-up of a person's face with perspiration coming down. I have to have some sort of an oral confrontation. And so based on that, knowing that he wanted to show the anxiety of the crew and the being tired, we said, okay, put it in. Other than that, everything in that movie was true. Although it appeared that Jack Swikert, being replacing Ken Mattingly, It looked like he had to earn his wings every day, that we were really worried about his competency of being an astronaut with the crew. That wasn't true at all, of course. He was a very competent astronaut right from the beginning, and he was really the guy to put on as a replacement.
Did I read correctly that the problem with that tank, the heater in that tank, had actually happened several years before it was even installed?
The setup for the accident happened about 6 or 7 years before, because of the thermostat was only compatible with 28-volt power, which was the power that we flew with. The ground power at the Cape was 65-volt power. Also, the tank that we had was originally designated for Apollo 10. It was dropped at the factory. Thought that they had refurbished it, but they had broken or something like that, a tube inside the tank that was only used to detank the thing on test, take the oxygen out of the tank on test, not in flight. So when we checked it, it worked perfectly for everything in flight. But when they went to detank it, about 2 weeks before the flight, during the final test, we call it a countdown demonstration test, they used ground power to turn the heater on because they couldn't get the oxygen out in the normal manner because it was dropped and we didn't know about it. And that high voltage welded the little thermostat shut, which completely damaged the heater system, but no one caught it because the heat, as we know now, got up to about 900 degrees Fahrenheit, boiled off, of course, all the liquid oxygen right away, but also damaged the heater system, but it was never visible on the outside that anything was wrong. There was no explosion or anything like that. And so when we filled up oxygen on launch day, the tank was a bomb ready to go off.
Also have to ask about the lunar module one, because it was never designed to do this. It's actually, in practice and reality, a pretty frail looking thing when you see it.
Very frail.
It was an extraordinary little craft, and it got you back.
Skin so thin that if you really desired, you could probably punch a hole through it. And of course, it had no heat shield. But we took it all the way back home again and jettisoned just before we hit the atmosphere.
What led to your decision to leave NASA and retire from the Navy?
I went to the advanced management program at Harvard and learned a little bit about business, probably not as much as I thought I did, and I decided to go into the business field after that. And I looked at the following career in the Navy, but I kind of figured that if I was on the selection board and there was Lovell on one side who spent 11 years with NASA, and here's another fellow that had 2 tours of, the Navy and various naval schools and colleges, who would I select for admiral? I had been a captain for 7 years. I said, well, I'd pick this guy over here, not Lovell. And so I said, well, maybe I better go into business since I'm probably as far as I could go. And that's how I got involved. I got in the tugboat business, believe it or not, with friends that I knew down in Houston. And that was a very lucrative business. But then I left that to get into the telephone business, which our company down there was sold to a company here in Chicago. And so the people that we sold the company to, Centel Corporation, asked me to come to Chicago, and that's how I have ended up here in Chicago for the last 30-some years.
So much has happened in the last few years with NASA. At the moment, we don't have our own way to get into space or back. And as you were saying earlier, with Neil Armstrong's passing, an era has kind of ended. How do you feel about the fact that we can't get there after we led the way there so long?
Well, you're looking at sort of the loyal opposition. We thought that the present administration with the way they had approached the NASA budget was trying to develop technology but didn't have a mission to it. And we thought that the NASA should really designate a mission and then figure out the technology to accomplish that mission, whether to go back to the moon, which we thought would be the next feasible step, because Apollo didn't even scratch the surface of the moon. And we had never been on the far side. And if we want to go to Mars, for instance, we need really look at how we would go to the moon, explore the moon, do things, because that would give us a very good feeling about how we can go all the way to Mars. The technology for going to Mars is pretty well in house right now, except for perhaps the radiation. But actually doing it is different than just thinking about it or trying to design it. And so we kind of think that that's the way our space program should be headed, because not only the technology and the prestige of going back to the moon or going to Mars, but what it does to the young people of this country in the enhancement of education. I can remember way back in 1957 when the Russians put up Sputnik, and everybody in this country said, how could they do that? Don't we have all the technology? Aren't we the leaders in this type of technology? And here the Russians put up Sputnik. It really was a spur to the education of young people starting in 57 to 60 that kept on all through the period once we started our space program going. And now that we have sort of a good relationship with most of our countries, at least our European and the Soviet or the Russian people, and we're working together, this idea of cooperation on something that we can have disagreements with, but not things that would not lead to conflict. I mean, so it brings people closer together. And so that's why I think the program is well worth it. It's kind of interesting. I just read an article on Curiosity. Really a wonderful program, and how they got that vehicle down on the Martian surface. And they designed, they looked at how much it cost the average citizen. And looking at that, there would be about 140 million taxpayers in this country, and spread out the cost of that program over the 6 or 7 years that it was going on, it got down to be $1.47 a month for the people to support that Curiosity program. So these programs, I think, are well worthwhile. I think they enhance the people, and the people are proud of it, and I think they're not willing to leave it go.
What do you think now, looking back, about your own contributions to the program and what you were able to accomplish?
Well, I hope that what I did added to the overall knowledge, technology of our space activities. A lot of what I did, of course, was necessary in research and development to further on, which all the technology now had spilled over into the Skylab program, and then into the shuttle program, and the International Space Station. A lot of things that we did in the early days now are taken for granted now in these new programs.
How does it feel to have made history like you have? I'm just curious.
Well, I'm just one of many people that did it. I'm one of the the end results of the thousands of people working together and accomplishing things.
Well, thanks for the time. I really do appreciate it. And
my pleasure. I hope it works out.
I think it will.